Okay, great. So it's time. Let's start with the presentation. Thanks to everybody for being here, for joining this colloquium. It's the fourth time we will have it online, so it's great to see all of you on screen. And this time we are very happy to welcome Dr. Stefan Partelow. Stefan is a postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen, in Germany. And he has a very interesting background. He's, on one hand, a social scientist with a PhD in political science from Jacobs University in Bremen. He also has a master's degree in environmental studies and sustainability science from Lund University in Sweden. So it's for us, of course, very interesting to have this interdisciplinary view, and nevertheless, because much of his work focuses on environmental governance and collective action problems. So please, Stefan, with this introduction, I give you, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Denise. Appreciate the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone here at ZEF. Today I'm going to present a project that we have at the moment, which is a 3-year project focusing on aquaculture sustainability analysis using the social ecological systems framework. But I think it's useful to start with this presentation with a little bit of background of maybe why I was interested in connecting with ZEF. And I think that'll become evident in the next slide here. So I'll first talk a little bit about a personal introduction and then a bit of my research that I did during my PhD and during my postdoc and a few other projects that we have at the moment. And a bit of the personal introduction first is that, as noted, I studied both environmental studies and sustainability science in kind of my core education in BA and in my master's, and then moved on to political science, but very much kept the same stream of focus on environmental governance issues. But I've been living since I came to Germany in between both Bonn and Bremen. My partner and family, they live in Bonn, and the ZMT is in Bremen, of course. And I live just a few blocks away from ZEF, actually, so I walk most of the time, almost multiple times a week past the institute. And there's after I finished my PhD, it was quite a large interest in connecting with other institutes in Germany in this postdoc project and in other projects that we've been working on, to see where we can find some collaborative areas where we can think about interdisciplinarity problems together, we can think about environmental problems together and development problems together, to link the few institutes in Germany which are exclusively focusing on that, and which I see ZEF as one of them and ZMT as one of them, focusing on development issues. So I've been going back and forth between those two cities, but I'm originally from California, as you might hear with my voice tone. And my mom is from Sweden, so I'm also half Swedish. But a little bit of background before I talk about the project, mostly related to my PhD research, which will help give you a little bit of an overview of why we have the focus that we do in the project that I'll present to you later. So for those of you who are familiar with commons scholarship or the work of Elinor Ostrom, her research really focused on framing environmental governance problems as collective action and commons problems. And a lot of her work, including the work on the design principles, which was published in her 1990 book, Governing the Commons, has evolved into the social ecological systems framework. And you can see a small image of that at the top of the screen. Some of you might have seen that before, but it's basically a conceptual framework. Well, it's a bit argued whether it's a theoretical framework or more of a conceptual framework. It definitely has a theoretical base in collective action theory, understanding how and why people cooperate to use shared environmental resources. But it's also a conceptual framing for understanding the interdependencies between social and environmental change processes. And that's mostly been evolved from political science and behavioral economist scholars, mostly in the social sciences, to understand environmental governance problems as a tool for which we can use to frame the complexities in environmental governance problems, for example. So the main problem that I focused on in my PhD was, can this tool be used to collect social ecological data, which is both, on one hand, contextually adapted, but also comparable. So the framework was more or less promised in a lot of the literature and Ostrom's writings as a tool which can facilitate that that challenge between needing to adapt our methodologies to understand place-based environmental problems, but also to facilitate comparability across those case studies so that we can have more generalizable theories about environmental governance. So we wanted to test this in my PhD, and what we did was because of the ZMT focus area in tropical marine research, we had a focus specifically on small-scale fisheries and small-scale aquaculture, and we applied that framework with different methodologies in different case studies, trying to pick different types of data collection, which would help facilitate different types of data and try to really get at the problem of data comparability, while at the same time trying to understand what the problems were in each of those specific contexts. So we looked at a small-scale fishery in Indonesia, or rather small-scale aquaculture case study in Indonesia, and small-scale fisheries in Brazil and Costa Rica, using a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods. Within each case, we looked at collective action theory, but generally we were focused on reflecting about the methodology through which we collected data and how we can make interdisciplinarity data collection possible, and if it was actually possible to compare the insights we had across these cases. And the conclusion was basically that this is really difficult and it's very challenging. And on one hand, while a lot of Ostrom's work is well cited and highly praised, it's very difficult in practice to make interdisciplinary environmental governance research work if you don't have methodological innovation, ways for which we can think about jointly collecting and comparing data across the different spheres which exist, the biggest one being qualitative and quantitative, but there's also challenges for integrating different types of quantitative data. And that's where you kind of have a discourse on mixed methods research. And what I concluded was this is possible if we focus on methodological innovation and if we really emphasize the transparency aspect of that research. And so it becomes clear what other researchers are doing so that we can use secondary data, and that we really emphasize more the methodologies which we use to understand those problems. And of course, I use in quotes the term arity, because I think it represents a suite of ideas, including multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity as kind of conceptual or discursive framings for the way forward. But that definitely seems to be of interest for this particular line of research. So as partly this is an exercise to kind of get a little bit more familiarity with some of the research that we do at the social science department at the ZMT, not just the Compass project, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but a better overview of what we do in general to see what the interest may be between those of you working on different problems at ZEP and what we do at ZMT. So one project which I worked on, which is related to the risk or the role of social capital and the role that social capital at local communities plays in being able to mitigate the risk of disasters. So what I did was I focused on a case study here in Gili Travangan, which they had a series of severe earthquakes back in August in 2018. And I looked at the role of social capital in that community in rebuilding the tourism economy, which is primarily based on scuba diving tourism. And we're interested in these types of collective action problems, it's not only specifically related to environmental resources, which are classic, which you might think of like fisheries and forestry, but also things like marine protected area governance and managing pollution and waste on these small tropical islands, and how communities, for example, small businesses in the scuba diving sector work together. So this is a project we have going on, or I have going on. This project, which you see now, it was a larger analysis of co-authorship networks in the field of tropical marine sciences, which was just published earlier this year. So we looked at how the patterns of co-authorship on the field of tropical marine sciences is very much path dependent on previous research, and also based on perhaps more colonialistic ties to certain countries around the world. And also that this is dominated by a handful of few research programs in North American, European, and Australian contexts. So you can see that. And actually the focus area, which is the tropics, which is in the middle of the bottom left map, doesn't have nearly as much focus on its own as some of the countries outside of that area are. So that's pretty interesting, where we have this more path dependency, discursive analysis of what's happening in our field, where it's more of a science studies itself project. This project, environmental NGOs and global environmental discourse was just accepted this week, so I'm pretty happy to soon share this paper, which will be out soon. And this was also more of a discourse analysis of the environmental NGO space. And so what we did was we compiled an original data set of almost 700 NGO mission statements and budgets and location and resource capacity, et cetera. And then we did a quantitative kind of word or discursive analysis about what they talk about and how that sector is basically skewed by the larger NGOs and which regions, et cetera. And you can see that, you know, it's actually a more heterogeneous sector than I would say the literature previously has shown. There is quite a spectrum between climate politics, environmental management, and environmental justice, and ecological modernization. So what we're doing at ZMT with a couple projects is trying to use more quantitative statistical methodologies to combine what are traditionally qualitative research approaches like discourse analysis by using large data sets. This project was the work of a master's student, which I co-supervised, where we're looking at network analysis or using network analysis as a tool to analyze social ecological interdependencies. So with network analysis, we're really interested in what the pattern of the network shows. So the meaningful information is the structure and pattern of the network and the role of the actors within that. And if the actors in that network are not only social, but also ecological, and what you see here is a map of blue dots showing, or actors in the network are scuba diving businesses, and the green dots are reef patches, coral reef patches. So what we're interested in here is what are the structural patterns within that network which can help us understand environmental governance of marine protected areas in a scuba diving context. Okay, this is probably my favorite project at the moment because it's more of a personal project. It's not related exactly to the ZMT mission in sense of tropical analysis, but it's a platform which I'm developed with a colleague, Michael Cox at Dartmouth College, where we are developing a series of online tools, which is based around the website called the Environmental Social Science Network. And we really want to, with this platform, use digital tools to help not just science communication between science and policy, which is often an explicit goal of research institutes like ZMT and with ZEF, but also to facilitate more communication within our scientific communities. So to have discussions and to have sharing tools which can enable the sharing of data and the sharing of teaching materials, for example, and the sharing of other online resources, to better have collaborative discussions within our scientific fields. And one tool that we're doing at the moment is this podcast called the Finding Sustainability Podcast, where we're interviewing practitioners and academics in different social science realms around the world, really, where we have a lot of different professionals who've come on the podcast to explain the work and how it links to environmental governance, et cetera. So anyone who's interested in that, please feel free to visit the website or to check out the podcast. Okay, so hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview of some of the projects we have going on at ZMT. And of course, those are just some of the ones which I'm involved in. And our social science department at ZMT includes 4 different working groups. So if anyone is interested in the other work we do, I definitely encourage you to have a look at our website or contact me. And I think we are definitely an institute which is founded on collaborative research and interdisciplinary research. And I think that also goes for ZEF as well. So any of those projects sound of interest to you, please feel free to reach out and we would be happy to discuss them. But now I'm going to talk about our new project, which is funding myself for the next 3 years, called Compass, Comparing Aquaculture Systems Sustainability. So kind of the premise for why we're focusing on aquaculture is that you can see in the top graph, basically the capture fisheries, so normal, what we say, or more normal fisheries production in terms of global tonnage versus aquaculture over the last 40 years. And what you can see is that while capture fisheries have more or less stagnated or they've kind of plateaued, aquaculture is on a global rise and now actually produces more fish tonnage globally than capture fisheries. But on the bottom, what you see is the amount of literature in both comparatively. And there's been a lot of research over the decades on fisheries, and there is really a pretty severe mismatch at this point between what we know about fisheries governance and what we know about aquaculture compared to their global relevance. And that's really the framing of why we're focusing on aquaculture instead of small-scale fisheries, which has been a traditional focus of ZMT, but also of common scholarship over the decades. So you can also see here, which is just showing a percentage of aquaculture in terms of total protein consumption, and also just total food production. And this is even an outdated graph from 2014. So the bottom bar, what you see of aquaculture is much closer or even more than capture fisheries at the moment. And so Indonesia there was a very interesting paper published by Gentry et al. 2017, which was mapping the potential for marine aquaculture expansion, looking at a variety of ecological factors. And Indonesia was one of those countries identified as one of the countries with the highest potential for marine aquaculture expansion. I mean, one of these reasons is partly that Indonesia is very much an island and decentralized geographic area. So there's a lot of coastal space and also just a huge potential for the right conditions where we can see the expansion of aquaculture really thriving and being a part of that economy. So within that context, we have this proposal which was funded by the BNBF Bioeconomy line last year, which is now started actually in March already. So the PI on this project is Achim Schluter, who some of you may be familiar with. I think he can't join today, unfortunately, on the call. And myself as the postdoc within the project for 3 years, and then Ben Nagel, who is now joined as the PhD student in one of the working packages, and Adiska Paramita, who I believe both of them are on the call, so we can have questions with all three of us later for those who are interested, are going to be joining in doing this project over the next 3 years. And we also have 2 full-time Indonesian researchers who are joining us at our partner universities, which is the University of Mataram on Lombok and Bogor Agricultural Institute in Bogor. So a little bit of the conceptual framing of this project to start with is that it's framed in these 4 working packages around system target and transformative knowledge, which is a conceptual frame for sustainability science or transdisciplinary sustainability science research. So on one hand, we want to develop system knowledge. So we want to understand the underlying dynamics and conditions of how social aquaculture systems function as social-ecological systems, and what are the interdependencies between social and ecological features of that system. So that's basically working packages 1 and 2. It's very much a diagnostic approach, applying Eleanor Ostrom's framework to understand those conditions and dynamics. And work package 3, or the focus on target knowledge, we're very much interested in what are the normative goals shaping development trajectories for aquaculture in this particular area. So what are the values, what are the desires of local stakeholders in that region for their development of their communities within the context of aquaculture? And we're going to focus here really on deliberation processes. So how different actors from different stakeholders come together and discuss those challenges and how they can create shared visions. And I'll explain how we're going to do that in a second. And then we have a transformative element. So how do we put that knowledge which we've gained as a feedback into making change processes happen locally? And this involves developing a database and, of course, synthesizing the knowledge we have in the project. And that's going to involve the Environmental Social Science Network project, which I outlined previously. So here's a bit of the capacity for who's going to be involved in those projects. It doesn't add too much more to what I said there. It just shows that, Ben, who's going to focus on work package number 1, is going to be focused on those social ecological dynamics, and Diska, who's focusing on work package 3, is going to be the PhD student in the 3rd working packages, and those are going to be the 2 main focal areas of the project. So, what we're interested in the context of Lombok in that 1st working packages is, we know that globally aquaculture is a very heterogeneous sector. There's lots of different types of farming systems. There's lots of different types of inputs required. There's different supply chains based on the different species which are grown. There's different types of knowledge which are needed based on the types of technology which are used to grow the species. And what we're interested in is mapping out the social ecological heterogeneity of aquaculture systems across the island of Lombok. And in the middle there, you can see a map of Lombok, which is the island basically to the east of Bali in Indonesia. And you can see there that it's split up into its sub-districts, and those are kind of government bureaucratic units or administrative units. And that could be an interesting sub-level for us to to be our unit of analysis, social ecological unit of analysis. So we can look at the different types of farming systems which exist in that island, and how we might be able to identify clusters, as you see on that map, of different types of development trajectories based on the underlying conditions. So what we want to know is what are the different types of development trajectories based on the social ecological characteristics of those areas. And Ben's going to work on that in his PhD. So there's examples of applying this type of work before using Eleanor Ostrom's framework. The work from Heather Leslie et al. And also the work of Javier Basurto, if you're familiar with their labs, published a paper in PNAS where they did this very exact idea in Baja California, where they collected data at regional levels, which you can see there, and then they mapped the kind of heterogeneity of social ecological systems dynamics across the Baja Peninsula. And then you can look at the relationship between the social ecological variables in those subregions to see how those are predictors of outcomes, for example, in fisheries, which was the focus that they had here. There's also very interesting, more recent work by Juan Roca in 2019, which was published in Environmental Research Letters, where they looked at kind of a regional analysis of the Volta region between Ghana and Burkina Faso. And they also did a more data-driven approach for identifying social ecological clusters, where they collected, it's quite difficult to see, but they collected quite a few data points on both social and ecological aspects, and then let the data show which clusters emerged and how to cluster the regions together in terms of their social ecological footprint, you could say. And that could help inform development trajectories, which are more based on a context which is regionally relevant to those areas. Okay, so moving on to work package number 3. I'm not going to talk about number 2 because that's more or less integrated into the work which Ben's going to do. But one part of this project which I'm particularly excited about is this idea that in science, we are very much interested in science communication and the integration of scientific knowledge into, for example, co-management process and local environmental governance processes. But there's a pretty substantial challenge in terms of how we're going to do that methodologically while still maintaining kind of scientific rigor in our methodologies for measuring how those processes are effective. And what we've tried and we've piloted out with work in Costa Rica over the last years is the conversion of Ostrom's framework, which you see on the bottom left, into images as a tool which can help facilitate more holistic discussions and deliberation processes and knowledge exchange during those deliberation processes. So for the same reason that the framework is useful in science, is that frameworks are a synthesis of what we already know. They're a synthesis of the knowledge which we have, and they help us think holistically about social ecological systems. That same process of triggering thoughts and analysis can be used within local management context, but we've tried to remove the kind of scientific jargon which is around it by converting those terminologies and that knowledge into images. And so what we can do is we can put stakeholders into deliberation exercises about what they view as the problems or the challenges or potential solutions for their environmental problem locally. And we can set that up as a field experiment. So we'll give some groups the framework, and so we'll say, hey, use this framework as a tool to help discuss your environmental problems. We don't really give them any instructions. We say, just if you need it, use it. If you don't want to, go ahead. And then we give some as a treatment group, and then we give some the same. We ask them to discuss the challenges, problems, and solutions without it. And then we can measure, or we can record their deliberation transcripts and then code that information for the content for which they've discussed, and to see if the content is different between the groups. And what we've shown in our pilot study is that the groups which had the framework discuss more balanced content. So they discuss content which is more related to both social and environmental issues, compared to the control group, which tended to focus more on social issues or governance issues, which were more pertinent to the individual actors themselves. And just like the framework in Ostrom's work is a checklist for researchers to go through and see which variables are relevant in environmental context, the stakeholders used it in very much the same way. They also used it as a checklist. Okay, well, who are the people involved? Who are the governance systems and policies at play? What are the resource units? What are the systems which are impacted? And provided for what we think is a more well-rounded discussion, and that also we think, and we would like to test this further, further with the work that Adiska is going to do in his package to see if that also helps facilitate knowledge between those actors more comprehensively than before. So it'll inspire them or trigger them to share what they know about those parts of the systems and to hopefully mitigate conflict in doing so. But a lot of these, it sounds very nice, and a lot of these are interesting hypotheses, but we really need to test these empirically to see if it works, and this is the goal of this working package. So I think we still maybe have a few minutes, but I think I wanted to leave time for discussion, because I think this project is in the very beginning of thinking about it. And I think while we have some very clear apologies for that. So while this project has some very clear ideas and hypotheses, which we outlined here, it's still very much in development. And having Ben here and myself and Adiska, who are going to be involved, it would be really interesting for us to hear your feedback or critiques. And we're very much open to discussing that about some of these hypotheses and some of the work that's being done here. And definitely welcome any questions that you guys have, and hopefully we can begin a discussion which can, not only help us for our project, but also build a dialogue for which we can hopefully think about cooperation between our two institutes. So thank you very much.